Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host, Bryan. We're going to wrap up this week as we usually do with an album review, going through an entire album track by track, exploring what each song is doing in isolation and as part of the larger whole. Today we're going to be looking at the artist Robounoishi. We have had them on the channel prior, and in fact the first track from this album is one that we have checked out in the past if you wanted to go see that. I think it was from a few years ago. I don't think we've had them on the channel since. What I do know is that this is a Vocaloid producer who chose not to use Vocaloids on this album, which is called Human. I also vaguely remember it being shoegaze adjacent and incredibly focused on emotional atmosphere. So let's kick this off, the first track, and revisit Suicide Snowcide and see what they're bringing to the table today. It's certainly focused on atmosphere. There's not a lot of melody in this track. Yeah. I don't listen to a lot of shoegaze, but I do listen to a lot of punk adjacent stuff, and that's exactly what would have happened in something like emo, post-hardcore. Higher pitch vocal note over there. That is a crunchy guitar. For some reason I focused on the cymbal. It is incredibly compressed, but also clipping too. I don't know if it is the process of that, or maybe there's something else going on where there's some side chaining and ducking going on. But I started to fixate on that sound, and it's a little annoying. All right, first track, Suicide, Snowside. Yeah, it's atmospheric. A lot of this is chords and textures, and the chord progression I don't feel changes much. I think there's a minor variation between the verse and the chorus, but it's generally very similar throughout. I wish I could extrapolate on that at all, but honestly, given the production on this, it's kind of tough for me to hear too much of the notes. I get a generally vague heaviness, a dreariness in the music as far as what I can make out of the chords, but so much of that is obscured by the heavy production on this. So it might actually be that the chord progressions are not as similar as I think they are. Just that they're aiming for similar emotional resonance, because that's really all I can get out of it. I don't hear too much of the chords themselves. I think it's the vocals that really help push the chordal information forward, particularly with the 3-stack vocals in the chorus. And those are just as moody and dreary as I feel what I think I get from the guitars. So again, there's just a lot of obfuscation going on here where the notes and the pitches are hidden, distorted by the production itself. There is another guitar though, as I mentioned, its texture also alongside the atmosphere. And this guitar over here is just pure texture. It's so many harsh frequencies that cut through the wall of sound that the guitars, drums, and bass guitar create. I hated every bit of it. I'll be completely honest. It does create a specific atmosphere though. It takes the already gnarly sounds that we have from the heavy compression, distortion, and clipping, and then adds nails on a chalkboard, scraping metal sounds to it. This guitar tends to be higher pitched. That allows it to pierce through the wall of sound. But also, once again, the EQ of it seems to do the opposite of what most producers use EQ for, which is to soften the harsher frequencies and brighten or extend the softer frequencies and just generally make sounds palatable. This is the opposite. It seems to diminish the positive frequencies and embellish or focus on the harsher ones. And it's, to me at least, it's just generally not good to listen to. It is abrasive in all of the worst ways, but as far as artistic representation, it absolutely adds to the atmosphere. It takes something that's already gritty and grimy and blown out and destroyed, and then just adds what would typically be considered bad sounds alongside that. It creates an atmosphere of destruction. And I think that every instrument leans into that really well on different through different processes. And a lot of this comes through on the production side. As I was mentioning there at the end, there's that cymbal off to the left, and every time it hits, it is compressed. it is distorted, but I think there's also clipping, and maybe it's a process of all three of these. Maybe it is a secondary component of ducking, of actually putting in an element where the strike itself is quieter than the shimmering. Regardless, it is, I think, a good showcasing of the type of audio destruction going on in this track. Every bit of this feels, well, it's not even that it feels. Technically speaking, when we look at a guitar tone in rock, in metal, whatever, we're looking at distortion, we're looking at overdrive. Overdrive is literally, and distortion to a lesser effect, it's literally clipping. It is taking a more varied sound wave and then cutting off the extremes, both in the higher and lower part, so it kind of blocks out. Instead of having a lot of movement, it's just completely flat. We're losing the nuance to create width. We're losing the dynamic qualities to create consistency. And through that process, we can create some really gnarly guitar tones. This is a process of destruction, though. We have created something new out of this destruction, and something that a lot of people really love, but the process of arriving at most of the guitar tones that we appreciate these days is through destruction. This just takes that to the next level. What if we add even more compression on that, which again is a reduction of information, and then add clipping to that as well? We clip something that we've already clipped. We're losing even more information. We're compressing it down even further. We're losing even more nuance. This is what creates the gritty, fuzzy, staticky atmosphere that this song resides within. It's why the cymbals sound so crunchy. It's why the guitar sounds so crunchy. It's why everything feels so dingy, and it feels like you're listening to it on, speakers that have been blown out on old hardware that honestly should be updated. It's not so much the audio that can't portray the music properly, it's the music that feels like that was created to feel like it's coming out of old destroyed speakers. And they do a great job of crafting this atmosphere, but it is through a production and a destructive process. And that's what makes it difficult to really understand what's going on musically here. The atmosphere, the texture of all the instruments, I think, is infinitely more important than what is being played. And I think that's why this guitar over here doesn't really provide much melody or harmony. Honestly, it's just going to get lost in the mix anyways. So just play textures. That's something that's going to come through because the atmosphere is texture focused. There's also the general size of everything too. The guitar and bass kick in particular are just massive sounds. This is what pushes the clipping. I guess I should have described this earlier. Clipping is just when the sound is too large for the input or the output, and it just can't grab all of the data. And so some of it is lost through the process. In the recording process, you would normally just turn down your input, whether that's turning down the input on the audio interface, or turning down the output volume on your amp, or whatever you're doing, your microphone. You just want to reduce the source a little bit so that whatever's receiving it can understand all of it. It's not overloaded by sound. But here, the intention is to do that purposefully. The volume on everything is just too loud. And so wherever that loudness comes from, you're just losing that information. But again, it's all intentional. It creates a very distinct style, an atmosphere for all of this. It's gritty, it's grimy, and I think the destruction is part of it. The track is called Suicide, Snowcide. I don't know what Snowcide is, but suicide is a destructive act. So having destruction in the production process just makes sense, There is one other part to this, though. It's the vocals. The thing about the vocals is that They are melodic. They're, as far as I can tell, really the only melodic instrument on this entire track. They do focus on harmony, though. There's plenty of places where we have 2 and even 3 vocal lines creating harmony, which is really what the guitars have been doing this entire time. But the guitar mostly strums along chords. It gives us rhythmic information, and then the chord changes every bar or so, whereas the vocals have moving lines. Sometimes the vocals even change. They move at different times than other vocal lines. It creates something that feels close to simply being harmony while also slightly veering into the realm of minor counterpoint. But the harmony here isn't quite as clear-cut as it is on the guitar. Now, as I mentioned, the guitars are drenched in all sorts of effects. I can't tell exactly what kind of chords we're looking at there, but when it comes to the vocals, they're not. They are quieter than the rest of the instruments and do get sucked into the mix at times. I don't think they're ever completely overshadowed, but they are fairly quiet. But I am able to hear the notes that are being sung, and very rarely are they in tune. For whatever reason, this feels like I want to take this personally. It's the one part of the track that I feel like I could gravitate towards. The atmosphere is not my cup of tea. The noisy textures are not my cup of tea. The production is not for me either, but I do enjoy vocals and vocal harmonies, and 3-part vocal harmonies are always up my alley. And then they choose to be out of tune with each other through a majority of the lines. This is an intentional choice, and I'm sure it's to add to the messiness of the song, to find a way to incorporate raw qualities into the vocals from the compositional side of things. But there's also the production side of things, not necessarily on the software side, but of actually creating the sounds. All of the vocalists here are, I don't know if dispassionate is the word I would want to put in. Apathetic, maybe. There's a lack of energy. A lot of the vocals are softer, they're not projected. And this kind of adds to the intonation elements as well, where there's not a lot of effort put into sustaining these sounds and in projecting them. There's also not a lot of effort in making sure that the pitches are perfect. There's just generally a relaxed element to every portion of this. From relaxed vocal cords, which create intonation issues, to just a relaxed sound in general. The range feels very comfortable for all these vocalists, and again, it's just not really projected. There's an airiness, a lightness, just like, whatever, dude, it's just how the vocals are coming out. And this sort of lack of energy or lack of intentionality ties into the grittiness of this track. Well, if the track is heavy and dreary, then this is that same sort of negativity poking through the vocals. It's just a lack of care, maybe, or a lack of energy to care. And it all ties together into something that feels like the atmosphere is actively draining our vocalists, and they're doing the best they can to provide the vocal elements to it, but they're just too drained to contribute in a more traditional manner. I think it's a track that is incredibly cohesive and works well. It's certainly setting a mood for this album. I'm going to assume that the other 40 minutes across the next 9 tracks might not be exactly this, but certainly within this gritty, destructive sound sphere, definitely something drearier and darker throughout. Let's hit some lyrics on this one, see what's going on there. Interestingly, there's not a lot of lyrics to this one, and I am using translated lyrics, not by hand, but by Google. A little disappointed that I couldn't find hand-translated lyrics on this one. it talks about someone committing suicide by jumping in front of railroad tracks, and our narrator saw that they were smiling when they did it. The next verse talks about how our narrator hangs himself, saying that I didn't know how ignorant I was beforehand. Yeah, as far as a destructive song goes, I guess this song about the destruction of two lives fits it. But that's about it. I have nothing to add to that. It's just a story of two suicides. Fantastic way to start the day, by the way. Not looking forward to the rest of these tracks if they're going to be musically and lyrically similar. You may have noticed that there's no time counter here. That is because we are on Bandcamp, so everything else is present, just not the duration. However, most of these tracks are in the 3 to 4 minute range, and there's two of them in the 5-minute range, so they're all fairly short. Let's get into this next track that I can't pronounce. Let's see what's going on with this one. This one is less fuzzy and destroyed, but it's still quite compressed in and muffled, as if you were listening to it from a room over or so. This guitar over here, instead of doing noisy texture stuff, we have this cool, like, twinkly emo work. The vocal production is very interesting on this. Probably going to be the first thing I talk about when we hit the analysis. Very interesting. On the instrumental side, this is fairly straightforward. We have chords over here. The bass is primarily doing pedal tone throughout this entire thing. And then we have the twinkly da 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 down over here on the right, where the intervals between the pitches are rather consistent, but that the riff itself does modulate with the changing chords in the progression. The drums are kind of bouncy. There's a bit of syncopation to them, but it's very locked in, and all of these parts are fairly consistent throughout the track. There's a little bit of a variation during the instrumental bridge, but I'd say that generally it's aiming for a very similar vibe, just a variation on that. Some new riffs, a couple of new rhythmic devices, but overall it's aiming to be the exact same thing, but just not quite the exact same thing, if that makes sense. But there is a joy in this. There's something bittersweet in it where I kind of get there being a general darkness, but a brightness. And I think that the twinkling sound over here, the bounciness of the drums, the lack of heavy, well, it's still compressed, but the lack of heavy distortion and destruction in this track, as well as the vocals being as bright and, well, honestly, kind of piercing. We'll get into that in a second, as they are. It is a light within a dark, gloomier, muffled core. So there is a darkness to it, but there's a hope that pierces it. And that's generally what this song is to me. Hope in a dark time. Or positivity in a dark time, or, you know, goals set during bad time. I don't know. It's that general vibe of finding positivity within negativity. And this brings me to the vocals here. There is something inhumanly perfect about the vocals. The vocals, much like the rest of the instrumentation, work off of short ostinatos, and often we will hear the same ostinato 3 times before the 4th one gives us a bit of a variation. This is fairly standard phrasing for a lot of rock music in general. Either a 4 or 8 bar phrase, or even 16 bar phrase, you know, just however long you want it to be. The first 75% though is the same thing mostly over and over, sometimes shifting with chords, but honestly the idea itself is solid. And then you wrap that up with the final quarter of the phrase, which has the variation on it, sort of the punctuation to the overall concept. And it allows us to go back to the beginning of the idea more smoothly without it feeling like just the same thing over and over and over. So the 75% of this that the vocals are doing though are very repetitive. You can hear this in the chorus, you could hear it in that finale, which I think was a post-chorus, but the vocals just kind of lock into the same like 5 or 6 note idea, and then just over and over and over, and there's almost a perfection to it. Compared to the raw vocals that we saw on track 1, this one feels almost robotic. And once I keyed into this, I just kind of felt that there was very little fluctuation or variation in pitch, in note length, in any of it. It always seemed, every note seemed to start and end at the exact same time as it did last time. And some of this could just be a copy paste. I think for vocals in particular, when I'm creating music, I tend to prefer vocals to be done in one take, where I will, if I'm doing like a guitar riff, I will record it once and then just copy paste that in the audio workstation if it's a really good take. But when it comes to vocals, personally, at least, I tend to enjoy a single take perspective on it. There's just something about it. I don't know if it's because it's the human instrument, but I prefer when it's one take. This sounds like it has been recorded once and then just copy and pasted, so each one is identical. But also there's very, very, very little variance in timbre, in coloring, and even in pitch. When they hold out a note for a second or half of a second, however long it may be, it just doesn't have natural variation. Humans are not great at perfectly holding out a pitch. It may sound good enough, in tune enough within music, but if you actually went and, got why am I blanking out on this? A tuner that displayed cents, especially if you could get down to the 10th of a cent or even the 100th of a cent, you'll find that there's just no perfection. This is one of the things that turns people away from stuff like pitch correction and auto-tune more specifically, is because it tends to lock the sound at a very specific frequency, and there's just none of that natural variation that human vocals have. I don't hear any of that here, that variation. Everything sounds locked in. And when you add that to the fact that the rhythmic elements seem to be consistent and perfectly replicated, it ends up feeling very Vocaloid. There's also some EQing going on in here that I feel is highlighting and maybe only specifically allowing certain portions of the certain frequencies to be put into the music, and not just diminishing others but hiding them completely. It ends up sounding very Vocaloid. Pitches are just what they are, and then there is an airiness or a breathiness that feels disconnected but present within a texture stack. This is the same sort of quality and texture I hear in Vocaloid. This is interesting for two reasons. One is because, as far as I'm aware, this is a human singing this. And since this band, artist, producer primarily works with Vocaloids, it doesn't really surprise me that they have decided to create a Vocaloid-esque sound for their human singer. But I think what surprises me more, or maybe interests me more, is just how close it is. Like, if anyone hadn't have told me that this was a human vocalist, I would be talking about this as a Vocaloid this entire conversation. There was portions of this where I was sitting there really focusing in on the vocals, thinking, is this a human? There's no way. It just doesn't register at all. There's so many details in here that are obscured or added in order to replicate the Vocaloid sound. And I find that really impressive. In the same way that, Vocaloids getting closer and closer to sounding human-like is impressive from a software side, taking a raw recording of a human and then manipulating it to sound more digitized and more Vocaloid, complete with the specific characteristics that a lot of Vocaloid software tends to have, that's equally impressive too. Sort of like getting a sound library to sound really close to the real instrument, but also getting a real instrument to sound very close to a synthesized version of itself. It is impressive from both angles, and I think that's what I kind of get walking away from this. Unfortunately, unlike the first track where I felt a lot of emotional synergy on that one, I don't really feel a lot of emotion out of this one. I get the general, hope within darkness vibe from the music, but the vocals are so far divorced from that. The lack of imperfections in it and the extra work put into creating, again, texture stacks that feel very Vocaloid-ish, it completely distanced me from the vocal work on this one. I appreciate it from arm's length, but as much as I enjoy this one more compositionally, I found that I was emotionally engaged with it less than the first track, simply because it feels more artificial to me. But I do have an appreciation for the craft that went into it. Let's dive into some lyrics. This track has one chorus that is repeated a second time, and then we get a truncated version of it to wrap the song up. And the verse appears to just be 2 lines at the beginning of the track, so it really just is the chorus stanza. It says, "I want to gather kindness in my palms and wipe away those tears. Don't cry. I'll be by your side. Even the loneliness of this night will become something you can laugh about someday. So let's look forward now, even though I'm not much help. The second chorus does change the very last line to say, so let's look forward now, I'm by your side. And it's just about helping someone through a dark time, being the light for someone else, trying to make them feel better and keep their spirits up when they're feeling down. I suppose that is kind of a hope in the darkness, though I suppose it's more of a light for someone else in their darkness. Kind of a parallel idea, even if it wasn't exactly what I picked up in that one. This next track is called Null. Let's dive into it, see what's going on with this one. If the first track was more of a noisy, gazy thing, and the second one was more of a traditional shoegaze, this one I think leans more towards grunge. There is still a noise component to it, but it is very aggressive and gritty like grunge can be, and it reminds me of some of Nirvana's gnarlier work. I think that's where the inspiration comes from, though maybe not directly, but it's certainly inspired by music that was inspired by Nirvana. And it is also a return to the noise of the first track. Now, something interesting is that the first track's title was in English, and so is this one. In fact, as I look through the titles of these tracks, for the first 8 tracks, we are alternating between English and kanji. So I'm going to assume we have an alteration of noise and softer sounds. I wouldn't necessarily call track 2 soft music. It's still heavily compressed and muffled, but it's certainly softer in comparison to the noise that we see on tracks 1 and 3. And I think we're going to bounce back and forth between these. It does change though, where track 9 has the letters D, X, M, and then kanji after that, and track 10 is in English. So we may see an inverse at the end of this album. But this is just a hypothesis as well. We haven't gotten to any more music. What is this track doing? It's loud, it's abrasive, it's noisy. We've gone back to the heavy destruction and clipping that we saw from track 1. And there is even more destruction on the vocals, as we have 2 vocalists this time. Throughout most of it, the left vocalist sounds like they're in a megaphone that is then being picked up by a microphone, and there's clipping that goes into that. There's just a lot of texture destruction there. But then we also have vocals over here that are compressed and distorted and maybe even overdriven, but are also screamed before it hits the microphone. So there's the natural compression and then the digitized compression that goes into that. And honestly, for a while, I thought it was a guitar, and I'm still only like 60% sure it's a human voice, having the song been over now and experienced it all. It does create this cadence though. Bum, 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 bum. It's this baseline feeling, and then the explosion, the eruption of sound. It's piercing, it's louder, it's wider, it's more layered. And then we get the sort of subdued. Again, this is very intense overall, but contrasting between the 2 sounds, this one's a subdued one. Whereas track 1 felt like it was going for something heavier and drearier, track 2 was going for a weight but positive. This one pulls in angst. This is just an angry song. A lot of the screaming leans into that really well, but also the filth and noise of it. That's always going to feel angsty, and you can put that in a few different ways. I mean, track 1 didn't feel angsty while it was also noisy. But this kind of rapid shift between lows and highs, I think because of grunge, is kind of always going to carry that sound for me. It's a very short track though. It kind of does its one thing and is over. So I guess we're just going to have one analysis segment here, and it's going to be over. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with this track. It talks about a fallen bird losing its wings, falling into a burnt tower, awaiting a day of resurrection in a slumber. Oh, a bird, resurrection, burnt tower. We honestly have figurative language pointing towards a phoenix here. The next stanza says rebirth, return, disappearance, reconstruction, rest, second coming. All of this is just about a new tomorrow. The next stanza says the angel's wings are stained jet black, and the flute announcing the end is already sounding. Amidst the screams, the world ends. Ascension. That's it. I mean, I guess if this song is ultimately about the destruction caused by someone who was maligned and then grew or reborn figuratively, maybe literally, more powerful and destroyed everything around them, the music kind of fits that. It's definitely an angry track, and this seems to be about someone taking out their anger. Guess that works. All right, this next track I cannot pronounce. We'll just dive straight into it then. See how they continue this album. The static sounds like rain and the reverb feels like water. Well, there's certainly a division between the sound of the guitars and the sound of the vocals. Springy sounds over here. There is a twinkling guitar line over here, but I can barely make out what it's doing. I mean, this sound is just so massive. This is the fourth track out of four that just sort of ends. There's an abrupt cutoff at the end of the track, usually as some sort of note is held out. Instead of allowing it to naturally decay, the song just stops. And we have this wall where there was sound and now there's just none. It's just like the sound stops here and just empties out. Always feels kind of awkward to me. This is another track that kind of balances the gnarly element with a beautiful element. Same thing as track 2, though this one is quite different. It's certainly a unique take on that compared to track 2, and I hope this is something that we continue to see going forward, where track 3 was like track 1, but very different, and track 4 was like track 2, but very different. If they continue this idea of songs focusing on melody and songs focusing on texture, I'd like to see the variety continuing on through this album. On that note, though, There is a really big guitar sound here in the middle that dominates everything. The vocals have to fight to get through it. There is a guitar over here that I feel like really wants to be heard. It is a melodic, sort of a twinkly Midwest emo thing going on. Honestly, I can barely make out anything that it's doing. I can just hear that it's there and that it is changing pitches, but there's a bit of dynamic in there as well, where some notes are louder than other notes. So that means half of it kind of gets tucked underneath this massive core guitar sound in the middle. The drums are, well, the drums cut through the noise quite well. They're still very muffled and compressed like they have been, and there's a lot of syncopation in there as well, which I would expect from a punk adjacent type of a genre, to have some bouncier syncopated lines in there. But I have such a, oh, there's also that guitar. It's springy at times, like a spring. It's just a lot of pitch and placement variation, as well as warble. And it also jumps between low tones and slides up to high tones and slides back down to low tones. It is a very textured idea, more so than the melodic guitar over here or the vocals in the center. The bass, as far as I can tell, is just following along with the bass kick pattern on the drums and pedal toning it throughout. So rather straightforward once again. We had a noisier bridge here, and then that kind of broke through to give us our final chorus, I think, so that we could have a clean vocal line once more. I don't have much else to add to this one. It is incredibly overbearing. And it almost feels as if this guitar line and the vocals here are trying to be something positive, melodious, that's going to cut through this massive noise in the center. It's just a sound. It is texture, it is atmosphere, but it is also abrasive. And the two melodic parts get drowned out by it. And that's my best read on this track, because otherwise I can't make out anything else that's happening here. It's just a really noisy song. The vocals dipped down into a scream, I think, at one point, momentarily, before coming back into the clean. I thought that was an interesting way of feeling like of drowning within this atmosphere. And then treading water again, but I don't know. So far, though, it's an interesting album. I doubt I'll come back to it. It is way noisier than I would ever want to listen to. But it is quite authentic. I'll give it that. It certainly feels original-esque. We've certainly listened to gazy music. We've listened to emo music. We've listened to noise rock. We've listened to grunge. And we've listened to bands that pair all of this together. But there's something in this that still, I think, stands out a bit from their contemporaries, who have also smashed together very atmospheric and noisy textured combinations. Lyrics. Weirdly enough, this is a track about feeling numb. It's an interesting perspective here. I don't think the analogy perfectly works, but I'm also willing to bet there's something lost in translation too. Machine translated lyrics are usually pretty bad. Just machine translated poetry in general, there's a lot of nuance that gets lost in that process. But the idea here is that they don't think that they are like everyone else. They don't feel like everyone else does. They translate this to being cold-blooded. And they wonder that if they cut themselves and bled, would it be blue or would the blood be red? They posit that if they were cold-blooded, apathetic to everything, not being affected by what's around them, it would make things a little easier for them. but that they feel cold, they feel dispassionate about things. At one point even saying that if the blood that runs through me is lukewarm and dark red, then it is disgusting. It is wasted on a person like me. I don't deserve that. It says, because everything I see passes by coldly. I wish the color of my blood were blue. I get the gist of it. I really do think it's a translational thing that kind of makes me miss a key element here. I just don't think it's an incredibly strong idea, even if the concept does get conveyed to me. At the end, though, they say, well, it's probably pointless. And I don't know what they're referring to there. Is it the whole thought process? Is it the differentiation between blood color? Is it the idea that they wish they were cold-blooded? Is the whole thought process in and of itself pointless? To me, it just seems like they lack self-esteem, but it could also be a lack of energy, of empathy. They're cold to everything. They're also dismissive of their own thoughts. Being cold to that as well. All right. Next up, we have the midway point of the album called Yucky. English title, I'm expecting a lot of noise. Let's dive in. Oh, okay. I am not enjoying that hi-hat though. This is another track where the vocals sound closer to a Vocaloid than a human. A little bit more of maybe a ballad this time. This ride cymbal is a lot more palatable than the hi-hat is. The bass kick is overpowering though, but I suppose that's par for the course with the low end of this album being really blown out in general. Also, you can hear the bass kick on both sides. The low end is here, but the thumpier part is over here. An abrupt ending. The vocals here feel very Vocaloid to me again. There's just a locking into a pitch with very little variation to it. And I think it's a shame because this and track 2 share the qualities of having clean vocals in them. Cleanish. Clean as far as this album wants to get. These are the places where I think that personally I would be able to understand more of the vocals emotionally. And I just can't. I lack that emotional connection with these vocals because they sound inhuman. They have that robotic quality to them. I still think it's pretty interesting that, again, as far as I know, this is a human vocalist here. So doing the work to modulate it, to make it sound so flat and robotic, it's pretty interesting from a technical side. Just artistically, it's bouncing off of me. But it does cut through an overall gloomy, heavy mix. Just like track 2, we have primarily chords here and a slightly syncopated drum part. It is primarily here just to give us the feeling, which is kind of dreary again. As much as I was talking about the first 4 tracks, each having their own personality while still sitting within a blueprint of the album, this one feels like we're retreading the same ground as track 2 did. It does completely throw out my hypothesis of the naming scheme and the relationship to the kind of music we were going to hear though. And I think that track 4 already kind of went in that direction, as it was a bit noisier than a kanji track would have been based on my expectations, but it still had clean vocals in it. And I was kind of hoping that the pattern persisted, but that's just not the way they wanted to go, which is fine. But this one ends up being very hazy, very shoegazy, just dreary atmosphere, lots of effects, lots of fuzz and distortion and static, and then clean vocals cutting through everything. I am noticing something though. We'll get into the lyrics on this one, but at this point, the title of the album is Human, and musically this is rough. This is gritty, this is dirty, it's compressed, it's imperfect. I think that does a great job of creating a sonic experience of the human experience, the sonic representation, I should say. But I think that lyrically we're also looking at, well, a lot of negativity, but a wide range of human emotions too. I do hope, I kind of doubt we'll get there, but I do hope that some of these tracks are a bit more positive, to have a more complete experience of human emotions. But I do think that these songs, being as personal as they are lyrically, and as imperfect and raw as they are musically, do match up with the album title. And it wouldn't surprise me if the rest of this album continues on with this trend of kind of making an album of the messiness of humanity. And I think that's pretty cool. Anything else you want to add to? Oh, yeah, dude. Okay, so most of this track was very gazy. Atmosphere, chords, melody, straightforward. Then we get a really noisy solo. I found this stood out to me. I'm not a big noisy guitar kind of person. I've already stated this a couple times in this video alone, but I think that it kind of worked here. From a thematic perspective, it was a thrashing out against form, against cohesion. So much of this album has been noisy textures, and this track kind of didn't go in that direction. A big atmosphere, lots of fuzz, sure, but if we look at the composition itself, palatable harmony, palatable melody. The guitar comes in here and makes a mess of all of that. I think this lines up well with this idea of humanity and messiness. And I can't wait to see what the lyrics are exploring in this track and how that might pertain to kind of the musical equivalent of taking a temper tantrum in the middle of a song. So let's dive into those lyrics and see what's going on there. Lyrically, we have a song about the pain of an old relationship. The chorus says, even if you sweep it away, the scars remain. The phrase, I loved you, is now a pathetic sentiment. Leave it behind. The warmth is a mirage. Gently vanish the smile that burns into my heart. We can pray, we can watch the sun, we can run. We will fade away just as the passing of seasons does. It is hanging on to the pain of that failed relationship. And it's not even a failed one. It could just be a finished one, a past one. But the feeling of being loved once before, our narrator views as a mirage of warmth. The phrase, I love you, is a pathetic sentiment to them. It's almost as if they feel that they were tricked into being loved, and now that that person is gone and they have no one else to show love towards them, they viewed it as a fallacy all along, something they should never have engaged with at all. All I can do is hope that these lyrics come from a place that isn't how this person feels anymore. It's an incredibly sad state to be within, to emotionally distance yourself from moments of human connection and vulnerability because it's no longer present. But I suppose that's what most of this album is. It's a mix of depression and coldness and numbness and a walling off of vulnerability. Because being sad and lonely is at least familiar. It's not a great state to be in, and one of the tracks, well actually the first track the song opens with suicide and the person smiling as they commit it. But we also have other tracks where they basically say that living isn't that great, that they're just full of pain, that no one sees them anymore. And it's just a really depressing album so far. And you just kind of want to give him a hug and be like, bro, dude, it's fine. Seriously, you'll get past this. But instead, every track withdraws further in. And unfortunately, you just can't do anything about it because it's music, it's art. You can just experience it. I wonder if I had heard this album, well, that's a mixed bag. Musically, I think I'm like 0.00001% more receptive to noise music like this today than I was 20 years ago. But lyrically, I probably would have really enjoyed this. Probably comes no surprise, as most of y'all know, I grew up in the emo scene. I dressed the part, I listened to the music. I was a sad boy. There's no way around it. And lyrics like these, I mean, I used to listen to music like this all the time. It was always the ballads, the sad, vulnerable, emotive tracks that I would play on loop from bands, more so than anything else on the albums. And so I probably would have gravitated to this at a time, and even at a point in my life when maybe I was more receptive, I would have been less receptive to the sound, but more receptive to creating a musical identity. We're more malleable in our musical tastes in our teen years. And maybe if I'd come across this, I'd be more receptive to noise in general. But I think at the end of the day, these lyrics just are not anything I seek out anymore. I think personally for me, when I was in my teen years, I didn't really go through a lot of emotional events in my life. So this was a way to experience negative emotions, pain and grief and loss and sorrow in a safe way and connect with it. But 20 years later, I have experienced those. I don't want to revisit them. They're heartbreaking. They're destructive. They're necessary in life, but they suck. I've lost relationships. I've lost grandparents, parents, family members. I battle with my own depression, which I'm going to say is more realer than it was when I was 18 and said I was a depressed boy on MySpace. And there's just, I think my lived experience just makes this less interesting to me because I don't want to return to places like this. It's interesting how where life can take you and how that can change your tastes in all sorts of things, but music, sure, also media around that too. Music, movies, books. It's just certain themes that become less desirable as life takes its twists and turns. We're going to move on to the next track here. Let's see where we go on the back half of this album. Dissonant here, especially as usual on the right guitar. Interesting artifact in the vocals there. Pardon my phrase here, but I feel like it's a shame that so much of this is done the way that it is. It's a shame for me personally, I suppose would be a better way to phrase that, simply because it's obviously their vision of this, and who am I to tell them what kind of music they need to be making? But the core of this is emo, the melody that exists in the vocals, the chord progression going on in the guitars, even the bass work and the drum, all of this feels very familiar to me. I want to enjoy this. I really do. There's just too much noise, and the production also continues to get in the way. But at the heart of this is something I could find myself really liking, something I could listen to more than just once, listen to of my own accord, even. I do like the chorus to this, at least half of it. The production still muffles everything and it makes it gritty and raw. It's a very much a low to mid 5 production on this. And then there's the noise, and I mean, that's just its own thing. I'd say that the instrumental middle of this was easily the worst part of the track for me, as it kind of veered exclusively into noise and textures in ways that sound like pain, anger, sorrow, just a jumbled up of negative emotions. Again, this album does that really well. But it's something that I continue to understand intellectually. I understand they're using noise to convey these feelings of pain. I don't connect with that emotionally, though. It's something that I can appreciate. I see why they're doing this. But it doesn't really work for me personally. I prefer to explore grief, pain, and sorrow harmonically rather than texturally. But on the other hand, as y'all may have noticed a couple weeks ago when I showcased a few of my favorite tracks, I also really click with vocal performances. And I'm a real big fan of theatric, dynamic, contrasty vocal performances that really lean into the performing side of that phrase, where it's not just clean singing, but singing that feels like the emotion is accompanying the words themselves. I don't really get that here. There are a couple of tracks, such as track 2 and 3, that lean into distortion on the vocals, whether that's through the audio workstation, having compression or overdrive on it, or in one of the tracks we had a megaphone, and that certainly was widening out the sound itself. I never really get the emotion from the delivery. There's no exasperated sighs, there's no breathiness in any of this. There's no change between projection and softer things, kind of a feeling of drained. And I started to really think about that in this track because I couldn't figure out if this was human vocals or Vocaloid. Once again, really great job at blurring the lines on this album on the production side of the vocals. But the more that I listened to it, there's just no connection between the... This is going to be really difficult to explain. I don't feel any emotional delivery in the core coloring of the timbre of the vocals. I can hear breathiness alongside it. I have heard distortion on top of it. I have heard compression applied to it. But the vocal tone itself, the heart, the part of the coloring, the way that the vocals sound that is consistent across almost every track is I wouldn't say apathetic, but emotionally detached. The opening track had a bit of a lower volume to it and a softness to the vocals. I read this as apathetic, and I think within that single listen, yeah, I still would probably say that. But taking all of the vocal work we've heard as a whole, there is a consistency to them. Human vocals have a wide range of variety, not just in general sounds like projection and softness and airiness and fullness, but it also has a lot of micro changes in mouth shape, in larynx placement, in a bunch of other things that I don't know enough about because I'm vaguely picking up some terms from other people way more educated in the realms of vocal and singing than I am. Humans make a lot of micro adjustments that they might not even be aware of. It's what makes theatric performances as dynamic as they are. Everything I've heard on this album has felt like an effect put onto a rather static or flat vocal delivery. And so I kind of question things here. I believe I was told this was the only time that this artist has worked with a human vocalist. But the more that I listen, the more I'm convinced it's a Vocaloid with some really good production at times to give the feeling or effect of a human vocalist. To me, I think it is one of the biggest hurdles I have for getting into this, even more so than the noise itself, is that I'm not connecting with the person singing the words. If this were instrumental, I think I'd have an easier time. The vocals literally put up a hurdle, no, figuratively put up a hurdle though, by their addition. It's interesting. If this is a real human being, they are delivering the flattest vocal performance in order for it to be modulated later in post. That in and of itself would be impressive too. But the words are so much stronger than the emotion I'm getting out of the vocals. And it's creating a disconnect for me that kind of feels uncanny valley. It's like when you see a scene in a film and you can tell they used ADR on it or additional recording, where what they're saying, maybe the lips match the audio, but the body language doesn't. And you could tell, you're like, obviously the audio did not come from this take. And that's kind of what this feels like. There's a little bit of an oddity to it that just, it isn't clicking for me, and it makes my ear, particularly in that track, but I think retroactively to other songs, it immediately draws my attention to the vocals. And I see this disconnect, and it would not surprise me if moving forward, it really stands out to me now that I've begun to, I think, have something to point towards, aside from the noise, which of course is not my cup of tea, but point to something else on why I'm just not connecting with this. Again, I still want to put praise towards this. If it is a human voice, they're doing a phenomenal job at sounding very Vocaloid. If it is a Vocaloid, there are tracks that do a fantastic job on the production side, making it sound more human. And I know that the vocals being stuffed into the mix is certainly helping with that. Any of the harsher or more static elements of a Vocaloid are going to be hidden. Of course, you also have the compression and everything else that goes into play too. So there's a lot of ways to hide or disguise the general signifiers of a Vocaloid. This type of music works really well at kind of blurring the lines because a lot of the details are obscured anyways, as I mentioned way back at the beginning of this video when we were talking about the guitar work. So that's, I think that's where I sit right now. I still find this interesting. I think the use of Vocaloid is, it's still a wild west area of music for me where I'm impressed by the technology of it all. We can make vocalists, or we can make and write vocal parts with no human interaction in the same way that we have been doing with electronic music since the 60s. My history on synthesizers and electronic instruments is a bit, it's a bit fuzzy when we get back to the early stuff. Regardless, though, I think it's very cool for technology to get to this point, but I still think it has a long way to go until it replaces human vocalists. And I think that's one reason why when it comes to Vocaloids, I tend to enjoy more technical works that sort of border on them being another instrument, maybe a new instrument, or border into the realm of near impossible things for a human vocalist to do. Because then it's not just the novelty of hearing software do vocals, but it's also the novelty of hearing music that couldn't be created otherwise. Also, my general fascination with electronic music is in the side of it that's kind of impossible to do acoustically, or with electric instruments as well, but just, by hand. I feel like I went on this for a really long, this is going to be a big segment in the timestamps. Let me hit some lyrics for this track and then we'll push on to the final four. And of course, we have another track exploring loneliness and grief and a lack of self-esteem, poor self-image. Talks about staring in a mirror and seeing how ugly they are. Their eyes are clouded. There's no light in them. It describes themselves as nothing but a corpse. Says that there's no joy or ecstasy or pleasure or sorrow or fear. There is only grief in a sterile room. Even loneliness does not come by my side. The mirror just stares at me. No one can save me. It's another song about wallowing in this isolation. I don't have much else to add to this, but I do find it sad and ironic. It's ironic in a sort of cosmic way, if you will. The easiest way out of loneliness and depression is community. Getting out of this stuff by yourself is incredibly difficult. Even if it is just a therapist that you speak to, that is someone else for you to put your burdens on to help you through it. And so we have an album where they continue to slide into loneliness, where they push everyone else away, and that's part of why they can't get out of this. It is the saddest part of this. I don't view the end of this album being positive at all. They continue to run away from anything that could help because, as far as I can see it, it scares them. They'd have to put in some sort of effort somewhere. And I will tell you, putting in effort when you're at your lowest is one of the biggest asks you can have of someone. It is not an easy task at all. I was going to add something else, but I think I'm going to wait until the end of the album and see where these last few songs go lyrically before I touch on that idea there. This next track is called Phantom Girl in Summer. Let's dive in. It's interesting because there's a little bit of wistfulness in here that we haven't heard elsewhere. I don't know if it's a production trick or if it is the two chords they're using here, but it feels more hazy like a memory rather than hazy like numbness. Over here, there's not really chordal movement, it is just sounds juxtaposing the chord progression we have over here. That note right there was really strange, given the timbre texture and where the placement of the sound should have been. We saw that on some of the higher notes of the previous track as well, where I just don't think the delivery of that sound matched the textures we got. Yeah, this is going to be a quick little analysis segment. This is one of the more straightforward tracks, although they're all fairly straightforward. We've got an emo, melancholic chord progression here. We've got a sort of syncopated a little bit of syncopation in the drum part. All of this is kind of flattened out, though, as the production has consistently been on this album. And I think this is interesting because what I want out of this album more than anything is dynamics. I want the drums to feature more qualities of their characteristics. I want the vocals to be less fuzzy. I want the guitars to sound like guitars. I want the entire song to be less muffled and more expanded. Everything about this feels like it's been muted and flattened off, and the interesting parts, the dynamic qualities of the characteristics of these tones are shaved off in order to create something flat and consistent. And this is what I described at the beginning of this, but I didn't quite understand how it all fit in. This album is primarily looking at people, or maybe a person constantly showing different parts of their life, but every track is mostly about a numbness, a loneliness. It is about the brightness of life shaved off, removed from the experience and filled only with the darkness, the negativity, and for that to feel so overwhelming, not having any dynamics in life at all. Negativity every day, every week. And I think that going for this sound fits in general. I think the noisier, the grittier, the gnarlier your tone, it's going to do a great job at embodying pain. But I also think that this feeling of being flattened out, of just not being as vibrant as it could be, fits really well with a numb loneliness. That numbness is captured in the production of this phenomenally. That's really all I wanted to add to this because, like I said, compositionally, this one's fairly straightforward. I do find it interesting that there is a second vocalist here. We haven't heard a second vocalist since the first track, I think. It's been a while, and that was kind of cool. We got the octave layering there. I don't know if that one is human or not either. We heard that masculine vocalist in track 1, 2, I believe. But it's pushed into the mix just like the other ones. It's tough to tell. All right, lyrics. I had mentioned during the reaction that something about probably the chord progression felt more like memories. Something wistful in it that we hadn't really heard elsewhere. There is probably still a bit of, well, I mean, even being wistful is a wanting of something. So there's sort of the negative feeling there. But it felt like memories, more so than a haze of emotion. This track is about memories. It's about remembering a summer where she was there. She laughed. She talked about fireworks, her slender fingers tracing in the sand, eating ice cream together as it melted in the sun. Says, though, that she vanished, just like that, melting into the summer. It was all a mirage, a scent of soda, a white dress, all a mirage, all dreams. It's time to wake up. This expands on one of the previous tracks, I don't remember which one, where they had felt betrayed by being loved by someone that isn't around anymore. It's the same feeling. They said that the phrase "I love you" was, I don't remember what, foolish or something along those lines. The song was kind of hating themselves for falling into a relationship, into a social element, instead of exploring their loneliness. And this is pretty much that same thing. It's them getting mad at themselves that they were ever going along with this, because it would all be a dream and they should just ignore it anyways. All right. Next up, we have a track. I don't know what the title is. Let's dive into track 8. This just floor of noise sitting down here. There's a lot of pitches in there, but it's not harmonious. Okay. Okay. The phrasing of the vocals, both with the dynamics in the volume and the shaping of the sound, but also the pitch, feels more natural this time around. So maybe it is a real vocalist. I keep going back and forth. And then that pre-chorus has me questioning it again. That sounded very Vocaloid. There is a positivity to this though. It's bittersweet, but it's there. A little bit of hope that we haven't seen since, what was it, track 3, track 4, where they were consoling a friend. We're going to roll this into the next one. I don't have a lot to add to that track. A lot of sad chords, but some positivity within, and I think the least amount of noise we've heard in a track so far. Okay, I was thinking it was kind of clear for a moment, but of course we can't have that. Those are really high pitch. I know they're falsettos, but maybe they're also whistle tone? They're full bodied and they sound so effortless for their range. So that was just white noise from a tape? I honestly thought it was rain. All right. As I had mentioned previously, track 8 I don't have a lot of thoughts on. It does the emo thing pretty well. It's a little bit of hope peeking through it like we had seen in a couple of the other tracks earlier on in the album. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward, particularly compared to track 9, DXM, I think is their most experimental track here. It is the one I enjoyed the least amount, but probably the one I have the most to say about too. We kick it off with the bass guitar. I don't think it's a bass guitar. Maybe it is. Arpeggiating up and down and up and down and up and down. Lots of space, not a lot of compression. Out of nowhere, the drum takes in everything. This is a massive tone. Eventually, we bring in the rest of the band, and yeah, you know, it's still a massively compressed, huge wall of sound like most of this album has been, but this incredibly dreary arpeggiation at the root of this track is still there. Kind of tough to hear, but it's present underneath the weight of the noise. This hasn't been totally unique. Many tracks on here feature something that's a bit more palatable, both harmonically or melodically, alongside grittier, noisier ideas. But here, I feel like it represents something we haven't seen too often, which is a really strong harmonic showcasing. A lot of the times I kind of have a gut feeling for what the emotions are because the chords themselves are disguised underneath the noise. And while that's present here too, we got to hear the chords first in isolation. I got to pick up the emotionality of that prior to the noise being dropped on top of it. Through that lens, even when I couldn't hear what that arpeggiation was doing, I could still feel it. This is destructive. I think that is the key word for this song. It begins dreary, heavy, depressive. There is nothing about this opening arpeggio that says anything to me positive. It is two chords, rest and tension. Both of them focusing on a darker, gloomier, unoptimistic emotion. The crushing sound put on top of that is the cherry on top of this, I suppose, in a depressive Sunday. It just exacerbates everything that's being felt here. There is no part of this that feels positive to be within, that feels happy or joyous. This is just tension and internal turmoil surrounded by depression and sorrow and grief. Where I think this idea really takes off, though, is about 2 minutes in when the guitar just starts soloing random notes, random lengths of notes, kind of stepping out of time with the drums, and the drummer says, well, screw it, if you're not going to play in the tempo, why should I? And they start just filling random things. There's no continuity to what they're hitting or, fluidity. It's just random parts of the drum being hit at random times. The song comes incredibly close to falling apart multiple times, and it really pushes right up to that edge. Temporally, I'm really surprised the song stays together at all. All the while, this melancholic arpeggio persists underneath. The very fabric of this song is on the verge of being shredded apart, of being dismantled. It would not surprise me if this song were about suicide, once again, as track 1 was. But maybe less so. Instead of just saying it happened and then we move on, we're probably spending more time within the thought process of it. This is a song where sorrow leads to internal destruction. I think I find it interesting then that the song does walk back. About 4 minutes into the track, the noisy guitar and drum section chill out a little bit, and we return to a chorus. I don't know if it is a chorus, it is a repeated part of the song. And something I want to focus on here is the dual vocals. They couldn't be further apart. We've had masculine and feminine vocals on this track before. We've had these octave differences between multiple vocalists. Here, though, we have some of the highest pitched vocals we have heard this entire album, mixed with some of the gnarliest, filthiest, harsh vocals that feel quite a bit lower in pitch. Harsh vocals don't really have a pitch at all, but there's over and undertones that come through that kind of create a feeling of a generalized pitch, and it's quite a bit lower than what the high vocals are doing. We have another separation here. Maybe it's a separation of the wants and the needs versus the environment and what the body's getting. Maybe it's a separation between what our narrator feels they're compelled to do and what they wish they could do. Dreams versus reality. I don't know. But there is a massive separation here that is not in a harmonious way like we heard on the previous track with the harmonized vocals and on track 1, I believe it was, with the harmonized vocals. Through that lens, a schism of destruction is the key theme here. There is a massive chasm between two opposing ideas, and that chasm is causing destruction for everything in the middle, everything else, which happens to be literally the song itself, but more figuratively, probably our narrator. That's what I get out of this track, and I think it is executed phenomenally well. I really appreciate that. Lyrics. So track 8's hopefulness that I felt in the music is in the lyrics too. The chorus that we see 3 times says, let's go to the place we once saw, the promised land that's beyond the horizon. Even if we're apart, when it's all over, we'll meet again. Let's fulfill that promise and meet at the ends of the earth. The verses talk about the face of a person that has parted ways with our narrator, and that they're waiting, that they're beckoning. We can't stay here anymore. Let's go towards the light. I wonder then if this album isn't about a failed relationship, but about a relationship that ended as the first track insinuated, another person who jumped in front of a train and committed suicide, leaving our narrator here in pain, in grief of losing someone that they love. Here, the idea is, I can't stay here anymore. Go towards the light, that the person I parted ways with is waiting and beckoning for me, that we will meet again at the ends of the earth, on the horizon, in the promised land. A lot of this feels like we're talking about the afterlife. I don't know if there is a larger narrative to all of this, or if it's just that so much of this album focuses on the same themes of pain and loneliness as someone else has left us. But it does seem to be that is a general story here. We start off with someone's suicide, and we're left with several songs about someone feeling alone. We have a look back in time, I think it was track 2 or 3, of trying to console this person and let them know that they'll be better because our narrator is here, that they're going to help them through these darker periods. But as track 1 shows, they didn't. And so the rest of the tracks are the narrator just feeling lost, lonely, in pain, wanting to see this other person. And here we have a track that shows how they contemplate the second stanza of track 1, where they hung themselves with a smile. This explains why they wanted to do that, and it puts an interesting twist on the song, because the loneliness, the negativity, the pain of this album, I kind of figured was self-created, an inability to move on from the past, and a dislike or maybe even a hatred of the self, which we did see in one of the songs. I don't remember. I think it was track 6, about sitting in the room with the mirror and not liking the person you see. But track 7's Phantom Girl in Summer now also makes sense. Someone who was with them, who promised they'd always be together, and then wasn't with them when summer ended. Could be the person from track 1. But what started out to me as an album of self-hatred and negativity is just someone in pain over losing someone close to them to suicide. And them thinking about maybe they should follow in the same manner. It's still equally tragic, especially if the first track implies the ending of the album too. And again, all of this is, even if there is an overarching narrative to this at all, Again, I'm drawing threads just because of how vague the album is and how consistent a theme is throughout the album. There isn't really much of a narrative to all of this. But it is interesting that a song that appears to be contemplating about suicide is also one of the most joyous ones on the album. And again, this does fit the second stanza of the first track. Track 9's DXM is one of the more metaphorical tracks of this album so far. It talks about being in a dream, everything stained red, a cliff lying before them that whispers to them to jump quickly. They feel a lot of eyes on them, and all of them are antagonistic. Not being able to bear this any longer, they jump, and everyone who was watching just stared, expressionless. Mentions it was like livestock being slaughtered. The onlookers had no emotional connection to the jumper at all. It says, in the next moment I was a bird circling under a red sky, and I felt free. But at that moment an angel descended upon me. Beautiful, with pure white wings, she reached out to me, inviting me to come with her. If I take her hand, will I go to heaven? It doesn't matter. I took her hand anyways. That girl is my revered angel. After this, we have a repetition of falling, sinking, swaying, and spinning. A descent in general here, but a dizzying descent too. More like a vortex down, a spiral, if you will. I don't quite know what this one means nor where it fits within everything else on the album, as I'm not really sure what's going on here. The first stanza fits along with the suicidal themes that have been present across the entire album, but the second one is more open to interpretation. It all started with a dream anyways. All of this could simply be a dream. Maybe they just want freedom. Maybe they want someone to give them some attention. Maybe they just want their angel back. I don't know. As I mentioned, it's more cryptic. A lot of the other tracks have been vague, sure, but they've been very clear in what their main idea is. I'm lonely, and I hate myself, I miss this person, very clear ideas. This one, just not so. We're going to wrap this up with track 10 here called See You, and there's two readings of this. It could be see you, like see you later, goodbye. That would be a fitting end to this, but it could also be see you, as in I see you. You are made visible, which would be a really commanding line for someone who has felt lonely and unseen this entire album. I'm curious to see which direction this goes. Let's dive into it. Well, that's certainly not leaning me towards the positive read on this. Vocals are sort of hazy and swirly right here, like they're lost in a vortex, or maybe like a cave. There's just a lot of reverb on them. There's a wood block back there, really interesting. Haven't heard that at all this album. I'd almost say there's a feeling of complacency in here. It's still really gritty, but there's a flavor of calm, maybe. I'm not 100% sure on it, though. It feels clashing with the sonic profile of this track. A little bit of tension coming in there. It's an interesting detail too. Many of these songs, if they don't end abruptly, end with static. Part of that is probably due just to the high amount of gain on these songs, where there is so much fuzz and feedback in the mix that's already there. But I think another thing is that it creates a hazy feeling throughout all of this. The static, the fuzz is exactly what gives shoegaze a shoegazy feel. Same thing with post-rock. It is the high gain, the compression, and the distortion all combined. And for this to sort of like have the guitarist stop playing, but that sizzle still present in the song, it's kind of interesting from that perspective, because if you just left your guitar alone, you might hear some of that with all of this stuff cranked up the way that it is. But I think it also creates a haziness to it. It makes all of this seem like static, black and white. Which I think for an album like this kind of works thematically. We haven't hit the lyrics on this one yet, but it's definitely been a song or an album about extremes. It's been an album that is devoid of color. It's an album that's devoid of dynamics, and I think that the static and the fuzz captures that really well. For many of the tracks, particularly on the back half of the album, to wrap up with that and for the album ultimately to end on that as well, seems a bit fitting for some of the thematic ideas present. Musically, though, I'm really torn on this. There's not a lot of noise in this one as far as dissonant textures and unwanted frequencies, overbearing sounds in general. This one doesn't really have that. It sits more in a traditional shoegaze vibe where it's kind of emo-ish compositionally, but as far as the atmosphere goes, it's just overbearing wall of sounds. But a lot of it is just sort of sadder chords or maybe neutral chords. We'll touch on that in a second. But the overall sound of this track is just heavy and weighty, much like most of this album has been. There's a lot of layers creating these massive sounds, and it feels overbearing in a lot of ways. This is really not too different from how most of the album has operated. What I find most interesting is what I get out of the chord progression. The harmonic side of this feels positive. Not hopeful like we have had in some other tracks, but not negative. Positive might even be a wrong word. It's maybe more of a neutrality. There is an acceptance, possibly, in the chord progression. A finding of one's place. Given the ending of track 9 and, well, the beginning of the album in general, I really hope that the complacency here isn't suicide, of finding your place in death. Still kind of curious which way this music goes, but given the very beginning of this track, which is a few seconds, a couple of moments of noise and heaviness, I'm kind of thinking we're going to go in a negative direction here, and they probably are going to die, and this is where they find their complacency, where they find their place, where things aren't as dreary anymore. They're not positive. They're not negative. It's that neutrality there. I want to give my final thoughts on the vocals here. There are some really high-pitched notes in this album. I think 3 tracks in particular housed them. This one had some of the higher ones too. There's something about them that feels wild. They're almost like whistle tones, but completely effortless. It is, I think, a part of this album that is ultimately having me lean towards Vocaloid for the vocalist. However, there was a track where we had some spoken word stuff that felt incredibly natural too. So I think where I lean on this is that it's a mix. There's certainly some places in here that are more human, more dynamic, having a bit more color and contrast to the vocal timbre, and feeling more naturalistic in the way that syllables work together. And there's certainly tracks where either the delivery feels a bit stilted at its core, or there's just incredible differences between the way that I would assume these sounds to be delivered versus how they sound in the song. And I think these high notes are a big signifier for me. They just don't feel like a human's creating them because they feel like there's not enough effort behind them. It's kind of missing the force that's necessary, the vibrations of the vocal cords or the vocal whatever is going. I don't know how whistle tones work. I know that it's something in here that isn't how the vocal flaps are normally used, and it's sort of like a whistle, maybe. I don't know. Again, I'm not a vocal coach. I don't know how all of this works technically. I know how things work timbrally though. And when I hear whistle tones, primarily in operatic music, but there's a couple of pop stars that really like to use whistle tones as well. There's force, but also air behind it. There's a softness of concentrated delivery. I don't know how to put words to it. I'm just not hearing it in these really high pitched tones. It's quite possible that they're just pure falsetto too, but they are really high pitched for falsetto, especially given where the vocal range of this vocalist is. However, I suppose there could be multiple vocalists on here. There's certainly a male vocalist or a masculine vocalist and a feminine vocalist. So, I mean, it's possible we're looking at multiple people here, and the really high pitched ones are only delivered by one of the vocalists. I don't know. I think that still kind of leans into my theory that there's a mix of human voices and Vocaloid voices on this, though. I'm curious what y'all have to say about that. I think it's going to wrap this up, though. Let's dive into some lyrics here, and then I'll give some final thoughts. So we bring back the concept of the angel. It says, "You were my angel, my light, and we both knew that one day we would be separated." Through this lens, track 9 is probably a combination of, would I really commit suicide? Is there really something on the other side worth diving straight into instead of waiting for my natural time? And the ultimate reason would be to seek out their angel, the person who I presume took their life in track 1 and was the person that they missed in track 4 or 5, 7, Phantom Girl in Summer. The person that they, were reminiscing about. So track 9 starts to make a little bit more sense to me through this lens. The rest of this track, though, is what our narrator is going to do with this want, the want to see their angel again. It says, "I keep searching for the meaning of goodbye. My contradictory heart is on the verge of breaking. Things I don't want to know, things I don't want to hear, so I close my heart off. But you were my angel, and I knew we would be separated one day, and all I want to do is tell you this. Goodbye. It's over. This is it. The angel flies away and returns to the sky. This was inevitable for us. Only I remain." At this, I was curious where we were going to go. The implication is that they're going to continue their life at this point as they have said goodbye to this person who meant a lot to them. They are trying to move on with their grief here. The final stanza is, "Hey, you, please live. That's my wish. I don't need anything else." It's a good way to wrap this album up, I think. It leaves the future of our narrator open. We don't necessarily know what they're going to do, but there is a demand, almost a command here. If you're going through something similar, if you have suicidal thoughts, if life seems hard, keep living. Because I'm going to assume that even though it wasn't explicitly stated in the text, our narrator has found something to live for. And they're going to try to move on with their life. And as heavy and dark and depressive and noisy and destructive as this album has been, if our narrator can experience all of this and come out the other side saying, "I choose life," well, maybe somebody listening to this music can find that same strength and purpose too. And so for the album to be called Human, I initially read that as a human experience, to bring strong emotional components into the musicality of it, to focus on pain and sorrow and grief in the music, which it does really well, but there's also hope and optimism and complacency in this album as well. Positive, albeit lesser present in the album, but positive emotions. It is the human experience, but it's also the command to remain human. If you take your life, well, that's it. At least from one perspective. There's nothing else on the other side. From a more spiritual perspective, you lose your humanity. You become the angel or the ghost or whatever your perception on the afterlife is going to be, your spirit. But this is an album about remaining human. To live with your feelings, to feel them, to experience them, and to remain in your human body. To continue on with the human experience. Things will improve eventually. You just got to stick with it. And that's what the album wraps up on. Just please live. And I think that's gorgeous. These are my thoughts then on, what was this band called? Robounoishi, with their album Human. What did you think of this? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said or correct me on? Do you have your own take, perspective, or opinion on this? Please let me know. Put all of that as well as anything else you'd like to add into the comment section below. Above that, in the description box, is a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. That wraps it up for today, but I'll be back tomorrow, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 3 p.m. UTC. We're going to do about a 2.5-hour stream. If you can make it over to twitch.tv/criticalcomposer. We hang out, we listen to music, we chit-chat about all sorts of stuff. It's a bit more lax than the deep analysis here, but it's a great place to chat with fellow like-minded music people who are also open-minded about music in general, as well as to discover some new music. We're going to check out like 12 to 14 new songs. Well, they're new to me anyways. If that sounds like a blast, head on over there tomorrow at that time. Otherwise, the video is always up by the end of the day. And Monday, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we'll kick off next week's theme. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.